Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sue Hegland, and I'm a board member with the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association. You are hearing me, but you are seeing Pete Bowers at this moment, and we are really delighted to bring you this webinar tonight with Pete. We have a lot of people attending tonight's webinar, and so you'll notice that we've muted your microphone. Everyone's microphone is muted so we can hear each other, but you can communicate with us at any time by typing in the GoToWebinar control panel window that you should see on your computer. And if you have questions or comments, type them there and we'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. We also wanted to let you know that we are recording this webinar and we'll post a link to that recording on our website in just a couple of days. When that's up, we'll send a follow-up email with the link, and we will also include a link to a workshop booklet and a list of definitions and terms that Dr. Bowers has put together. So hopefully you can just relax and watch this webinar without feeling that you have to take notes on everything that's said. I do want to let you know, too, that we are able to provide these webinars free of charge because of the generosity of both our speakers, and we really appreciate Pete's willingness to do this webinar for us, and the generosity of our membership. If you are a member of IDA, we really want to thank you for your support. If you are not a member yet, please consider joining. Your membership supports our work, including webinars such as this one. And we also hope you can join us on April 11th when our branch will be holding our annual conference in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We'll send you information on both the membership and the conference in our follow-up email. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Pete Bowers, who you are looking at. Pete spent 10 years as an elementary teacher in international schools in Canada, and he spent most of that time under the very common impression that English spelling is irregular and full of exceptions. When he came across a resource called Real Spelling, which I'm sure you'll hear more about as Pete talks, that all began to change. He and his students began to learn about the order and the structure of the English writing system, and they began to investigate English spelling using scientific principles, which Pete called structured word inquiry. This new understanding inspired Pete to go back to graduate school and pursue his PhD, where he researched the impact of morphological interventions on student learning. And guess what? He found out that they make a big difference for all students, but particularly our most struggling learners. I was able to hear Dr. Bowers speak for the first time at the IDA National Conference in Baltimore, where he was an invited speaker, and he continues to do workshops and presentations on structured word inquiry around the world. Pete has a website called WordWorks Literacy Center. You can see the icon for that on your screen, and if you check that website out later, you will be able to find information on structured word inquiry, on Pete's public workshops, including his summer course, and links to blogs of teachers that are using this approach in their classrooms, and lots of other information. So I should also mention that the format of this webinar is a little different than most that you may have seen. Pete's going to give us a brief introduction to structured word inquiry, and then he's going to show us how we would go about investigating any word that we want to understand. We invited you to send in words that are puzzling or that don't seem to make sense, and Pete has quite a few of those to start with. And I will remind you that we welcome your questions and any responses that you have to Pete's questions as we go along. Just type those in and we'll be sharing those with Pete as we're talking. So we've got about an hour and a half together, and let's get started. Welcome, Pete, and thank you so much for being here.
Okay, well, it's a treat to get to chat with you all. It's kind of funny talking to silent masses out there, but Sue's going to kind of be my companion through this, who will kind of raise questions that she sees you type to her. Hopefully you've been kind of noticing the screen and maybe noticing some words you can build from these various ways of revealing word structure. What I want to start right in with, we may have some delays in switching screens. Hopefully you're seeing something saying English spelling is right now.
We are, indeed.
Great. So what I want you just to think to yourselves for a moment is, how would the average teacher, student, parent finish that sentence? And I think, and for time I'll just kind of jump ahead, I think that you will agree that most folks would come to this conclusion that it's kind of crazy, irregular, irregular, full of, exceptions and frustrating. And that's the way I certainly thought about it for a long time. But what I want to do for this hour and a half is take that assumption and create and restate it as a hypothesis. And so if the idea that English spelling is crazy, irregular, full of frustrating, and full of exceptions, if that's a hypothesis, then the first thing we have to do is come up with evidence to support it. And that's why I asked people to send in examples of crazy English spellings, because that's how I always looked at it. Now, this is a list of words here. I hope you're seeing two and two, laugh, rough, and all that right now. These are words that were given to me from the last group when I asked this question, and I've added to that some of the words that were sent in from this group. So now design, habit and rabbit are next to each other. Someone was asking about why do we have this SC but also an S and a C grapheme. Then there's very commonly, and it's interesting, you can see how this person here brought up these KN words like knife and knot, and of course other groups had the word no. And then as well we have night and night, and then all these other words. Now they describe them as GHT endings. So these are all examples of words that people typically present to children and anybody as illustrations of how frustrating and irregular spelling is. But what I want you to consider is, if these are indeed evidence of spelling being crazy, of the hypothesis that spelling is crazy, we have to think about what would we have to do if it turns out by the end of the session I can make sense of even just some of them, let alone all of them, in such a way that you yourselves understand them. Because if a word that you used to think of as evidence of spelling being crazy turns out to be something that you can understand as making sense, then we're supposed to do something to our hypothesis, and that is change it. The way science works is you develop a hypothesis, you try to explain some set of data, something about how the world works, and then you look and see if the evidence supports the hypothesis. And if it doesn't, then you're supposed to change it. So that's what we'll start with that here. Now, one thing you'll notice here, someone offered night and night. Over here we have no and no, and there's two and two, and there's one and one. Those are all a certain kind of word. These are all homophones. And one thing that always happens when I ask for examples of spelling being crazy is people always raise homophones. And once one person does, then I get a flood of them. So what I want to think about is, why is it that, and I'll ask you this so you can type responses to Sue, why is it that homophones are thought of as examples of spelling being crazy in schools? And what I'm going to do is just take one example. I often like to start with this one. I don't know if you've gotten any responses there, Sue.
I have not gotten any responses yet, but I did have one person make a comment. How about words with ER, IR, UR? Students have such a hard time knowing when to use them. Someone said,
okay.
And then we had a second comment that said, I don't think they're crazy because meaning is different. And the other comment was, kids don't know which spelling to use.
Right. Okay. And the thing to keep in mind, though, is that, and some people have different levels of understanding of this, but I think the simple fact that in both those words that were sent in from the group that were asked for it, and in every group I've ever done, that homophones are presented as evidence of spelling being crazy, signals that we have been taught to think that. Now, if we had more time, I'd give you all a chance to sit down and write out as many homophones as you could. But and then we'd see how many of them happen to be spelled the same. But let's take a look at just these two words, here and here. And if I asked you someone's already answered this question, but why are these two words spelled differently? And the response that Sue already shared from somebody is that because it has to do with meaning. And this is what happens when I work with young children. If I talk about why are the, come over here, I can't hear you, and kids, by the way, love homophones, they get the joke. I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. I went to the CCC to see what I can see. We know that this is a part of the kinds of jokes and songs and stuff that we do with kids because kids get the joke. But when I ask kids, why do you think the word here for come over here and the word here for I hear you are spelled differently, they just say matter-of-factly, well, because they're different words, or because they mean different things, or because it would be confusing if they were spelled the same. And that is a really important thing, because I do this with teachers all the time, and when I ask them to give me examples of spelling being crazy, and they pick a word like here and here as examples of being crazy, and then I ask them why are they spelled differently, they instantly say because they mean different words. So all of a sudden we have to rethink a little bit, wait a second, is that really crazy that they're spelled differently? And what I really want to do is, all of the work we're going to do today is about thinking about our assumptions. What is it about homophones that make people present them as examples of spelling being crazy? Well, I'll suggest that the basic reason is because people will say, and they will think, and because they've been taught, that, well, they sound the same, so they should be spelled the same. And if I asked you to go ahead and make a list of as many homophones as you could, and then I asked you afterwards, well, how many of those homophones that you wrote down happen to also be spelled the same? You'll find out that very few of them are. There are homographic homophones, like to bear weight and bear in the woods and a bat and a ball and a bat that flies around. They do happen, but they're very rare compared to the number of times that they're not spelled the same. And that happens to be something that linguists noticed a long time ago. There's a book by Richard Benetsky that I find quite useful for this. It has a title that I always tease called American Way of Spelling. And in it he talks about a bunch of orthographic principles, one of which is described as the homophonic principle. And the homophonic principle can be stated in this way, that wherever two words can have the same pronunciation, wherever possible, they'll be spelled differently to signal that difference. And so what the homophones bring up for this is this. We treat homophones as examples of spelling being crazy because we think they sound the same, so they should be spelled the same. Below that assumption is this hypothesis number one that I hope you're seeing on your screen. And this is the hypothesis this is the assumption under which I worked for most of my life, which is that the primary job of spelling is to represent the sounds of words. Well, if that hypothesis were true, if we ask ourselves, how would homophones have to be spelled? Well, they would, if that hypothesis were the driving thing of spelling, they would have to be spelled the same. And yet you can investigate all you like, and you'll find that typically it's the exact opposite that's the case. And so what are we supposed to do when the data doesn't support our hypothesis? Well, the first thing is we're not supposed to just keep holding on to it. We're supposed to reject it, or another way to think about it is we're supposed to reframe it and say, well, come up with an alternative hypothesis. And if we find out that homophones are spelled differently because they mean different things, that's a nice way of suggesting a hypothesis number two, an alternative hypothesis, that the primary job of spelling is to represent meaning. Are you seeing that on the screen now?
We are, yes. We seem to be seeing things just as you.
All right. So, and what we're going to do then for the rest of this time is to continually come up with evidence from the spelling system to test these two hypotheses. And in every case, we're going to find out whenever there appears to be some kind of potential conflict between them, it's actually always this one, the idea of representing meaning, that is always primary. Now, I need to be extremely clear here. By saying primary, you see that it's underlined there. That is not to say that the role of sound is not relevant. It's absolutely critical. It's one of the means by which meaning is represented. The conventions for grapheme phoneme correspondences are incredibly well organized and consistent, but they operate in service of meaning representation. And a definition of any orthography in linguistics, whether we're talking about Japanese or Finnish or English or any orthography that has evolved, the definition in linguistics is an orthography is the writing system that evolves to represent the meaning of a language to those who already speak it. An interesting point in that definition is it doesn't actually include the word sound. The primary job is meaning. Now, in different languages evolve for different purposes, well, not for different purposes, but for different languages, and they evolve for the purpose of the people who speak the language. They don't evolve for the purpose of making it easy for foreigners to learn the language, and that comes into play with ESL stuff. But the point being, it's representing meaning to those who speak it. So now what we can do is go back to our words here and here, and somebody asked, but how do you know which is which? Well, it's not always going to be incredibly obvious, but sometimes it's there's quite useful things we can do when we ask the question. So for example, with the word here and here, if I'm talking to kids and I say, well, come over here, I can't hear you, and then we say, well, wait a second, they sound the same. Which word, how do you know which is which? Here's how you spell them. This is H-E-R-E, this is H-E-A-R. Does anybody see a clue as to which is the one for I hear you? And inevitably, I have no trouble with young children coming up with the observation that the word for I hear you has the spelling of the thing with which you hear. It's not now that might just seem like a random kind of thing, so I better be able to give you more than one example. And I want to emphasize, it's not that the word here has an H prefix on the base EAR. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that because these words had a similar meaning, and since these words had a difference in meaning, spelling evolved to signal for English speakers this is the one for hearing with sound. Now, let's take a look at this word here. If I say here, and I put this word here and this word here, if I were to make this little list, I think of here, there, and where, I think we would agree that place would be a good title for this set of words. And I would say with kids, where I'm always using my keys, where are them? I thought they were right here. Oh, there they are. So you just use the words that they know. And now I ask, does anybody notice anything about the spelling of these words? What do they have in common that links them? Now, if I could hear you talk, I suspect I would get two answers, surprisingly. Some of you are probably thinking right now, well, they all share E-R-E. Others of you have noticed that they all have the letters H and E and R and E. And it's always fascinating because it blew me away the first time I asked this question, and I get all these people saying E-R-E. And I thought, well, why did they just say E-R-E? How could they not see the H? Well, there's a good reason. In fact, the people who say E-R-E, I would argue, are demonstrating really rich orthographic understanding, because it turns out there isn't an H in the word there. Well, there is a letter H, but there isn't an H grapheme. And there isn't an H grapheme in where? There's a TH in there. I would spell the word there T-H-E-R-E, and the word where W-H-E-R-E, and the word here H-E-R-E. And that way you highlight for the kids right from the beginning that there's a TH in the world. And if I say there, where you feel at the beginning, you feel the th, and how do you write the th in there? With a TH. And how about where? Well, apparently you can write with a WH. And that is exactly why people notice the E-R-E and not the H-E-R-E, because their brain has done the very good thing of making these digraphs units and seeing that it's not the same as that grapheme. So now we see that there's this there and that there. We'll put these over to the side. Of course, the other there that people always complain about is this there, T-H-E-I-R. Well, now that I know that this there is for the place, I know that that's separate, so at least I know they should be spelled different because they're homophones. But what if I said their house is beautiful, they have a beautiful house, I wish I had a house like them? Well, now we can see that the links in these words, and we can see the link in meaning. These are about possession. And we can also see the link in spelling. They all have this T-H-E in them. Now, people will say there is breaking the convention about I before E. Well, if it's breaking the convention, that maybe just means it wasn't a convention. In fact, if you have ever looked at the I before E except after C, except as an A, as a neighbor and way story, you know that it doesn't work. Like I think I've heard there's over 1,000 exceptions, and if there's over 1,000 exceptions, it's just not a thing. So that's one way to think about it. And notice this isn't an exception. The useful thing here is the E follows the TH in all of these words, so it's a good thing the I is not there. And the other thing is this I shares a relationship with the Y. So you know about I-Y connections, so that's quite useful. I've also noticed many times teacher books literally tell teachers to tell kids that if English spelling made any sense, we spell they this way with an AY. Are you seeing that misspelling now?
We are.
Good. Now, if you think about it, why would that be a better spelling? And if you look at, I'm putting this on top of the other one, you see how it destroys the connection in this group of words if we used an AY. Well, why would people say that that makes more sense? Well, it may well be the case that AY is a more common digraph for the phoneme A. But it's certainly, the question really should be, do you have any other examples of an EY digraph representing A? Can anybody think of a word and type it to Sue with an EY representing A? And I'll toss a couple here.
We've got O-B-E-Y a couple times. We've got, it looks like an L-O-B-E-Y, but maybe that's a typo. A P-R-E-Y, H-E-Y.
We can do this. I think we have all the examples we need. We got obey and we have pray. Of course, pray has its homophone A with an AY, so it's a good thing we have more than one way to write A, isn't it? Because otherwise, pray and pray would have to be spelled the same, and that would be confusing. So the idea that we have, one of the things that people always say is English is so confusing, it has so many ways to write the sounds. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a bug, it's a feature. If we didn't have many ways to write the sounds, then we couldn't separate homophones. It turns out English, not all languages, English is an outlier. It's very different than most languages. One way that it distinguishes itself is that it is an incredibly homophonic language. We got tons of homophones in English, so it's a good thing, and that's why it evolved to find ways of separating words that happen to be able to be pronounced the same. So it's a good if we didn't have more than one way to write a phoneme, we couldn't separate homophones. Now the other thing we can do is we can start to think about, wait a second, if you obey somebody, what kind of person are you? You are very obedient. So now you see that this E isn't random. It helps you notice the connection to obedient. And what is pray? Well, it's about predators. So the E here is helping us. It's not random, is the point. And what we start to learn when we start this, what we're doing here is we're looking at etymology, a kind of etymology called synchronic etymology, where connections to meaning in words that were evolving at the same time found ways of, well, users of the language found ways of signaling those connections by using similar spellings to link words of similar meaning, regardless of pronunciation, and separate words that have the same pronunciation. So we see in every case that I've shared with you so far, it's hypothesis 2 that is carrying the day. It's the primary job is meaning. Now that as you see, we've been talking about digraphs and what graphemes can represent which phonemes. So you have to know that EY is a way of writing A and AY is a way of writing A. There's other ways too. You can't use a Q. You can't use an R. So there are grapheme phoneme correspondences that you need to know. But once you know that set, you need to know which one to use for which word. And at that point, you have to be dealing with all this. So that I just jumped in to a whole pile of words here. I took on a bunch of words that aren't here, but now you can deal at least with one thing about no. Well, a good thing they're not spelled the same. So that's one aspect of how we can deal with that. Now, I'll pause there for a second before we dive into some of these other words, and let you type questions to Sue about anything I've said so far.
Pete, there was one question that came in. Someone asked, is whey, W-H-E-Y, linked to wheat, W-H-E-A-T?
Well, see, the thing is, that is perfect, because the point is that's the right question. I honestly don't know the answer, but boy, it looks very tempting. But what you need to do is to know how to investigate that. And now, there's going to be some technical issues here about switching screens that causes grief. So what I would do with that question is I would go to Etymon, I would type whey and I would type wheat and see if they come back to a common root. It's a great hypothesis. And the good thing is there's ways to test the hypothesis. But boy, it's a good thing that W-A-Y isn't spelled the same as curds and whey, and that W-H is a useful thing, and if it's related to wheat, that would be a totally logical, it's a good hypothesis, whether or not it turns out to be right. But you see what it does, once you know that you can't even know to go on these kind of quests for understanding if you didn't know that there was a path that made sense. When we accept the assumption that English is full of exceptions, you never look for these things because you just think, well, it's just random. When we teach kids, well, it's just because, why would you ever look anymore? There's no joy in finding out just because. Now, I'm going to I'll do one more just because it is always, before I move on to questions that you guys picked, and the reason is because it is, I see in the research world, there's lots of researchers who have noted that English spelling makes a lot more sense than people usually think, and so they'll say that. But what often happens, they'll say English spelling makes a lot more sense than people usually think. Of course, there are exceptions, but not as many people think. And when they say there are, one of the words that is always cited is the word does. And what we need to ask ourselves is, why is it an exception? Well, you may have noticed this little box I have over here with what does it mean, how is it built, what are the relatives, and what are the aspects of pronunciation. We'll dive into that a bit more. If we did that with this word, if we're trying to understand the spelling, not just memorize it, we ask these questions. If in schools we put these on a list of irregular words, and you might say dirty old eggs stink. I remember being taught that. Well, even if I remember that as one word that I've learned, but I haven't learned anything about the system, and I haven't actually learned anything. I just memorized. If I ask a grade 2 class, a grade 1 class, a kindergarten class, who could use the word does? Someone might say, well, he does his work. He does well at school or something like that. Okay, we can use the word. I don't know why I spelled that way. Well, how is it built? Well, that means, is it a base or is it complex? Well, I can say he does his work, but I could also say he does his work, or I can say I do my work. And as soon as I say I do, I realize, wait a second, maybe there's a base, D-O, with the suffix es, which I've seen in other places, and now I can have D-O-E-S. Well, that's interesting, because I could also take D-O and I could add an ing, and then I would have D-O-I-N-G. So I do my work, I am doing my work, and when I'm all finished, I can say I do my work, I am done my work. D-O-N-E. Now that's interesting. Now I see this D-O make sense. The most common misspelling I see for does is actually D-O-S-E. Well, this spelling is actually the spelling of the word dose, and it can't be the spelling because there's no SE suffix. I've seen teacher resources tell teachers to tell kids that this would make sense if English spelling made any sense. Well, that's totally untrue, because if we spelled it this way, you wouldn't have the spelling of the base. There's nothing weird about an S representing Z. We can come back to that later. And when we do this, we can try to say, well, wait a second. I know an ES suffix. I know an I. Is it really an NE suffix? Well, what would I have to do to prove that it's an NE suffix? Well, I'd have to find at least one other word where it happens. Well, here's a nice parallel set of words. I can have GO plus ES, and I have G-O-E-S, go, goes. Nobody says goes is irregular, but people say does is irregular. Well, how could that be irregular if this one's not? And then we have G-O plus I-N-G, and I have G-O-I-N-G, and we can also have G-O plus N-E is rewritten as G-O-N-E. So I have does, doing, done, goes, going, gone, and I'll take a risk and come back to my first page. Hopefully you're seeing that front page, and you see I can make a matrix. Are you seeing my matrix on do and go?
It is just...
Is it there now? Okay. And you
Yes,
see what
it is now there.
Okay. And what's happening now is by investigating a word that we used to think was crazy, we would only investigate it if we had a sense that there might be a reason. Once we have that sense of then we investigate it, we look at what does it mean, how is it built, what are the relatives, and now we can deal with the pronunciation. Well, how do you pronounce the base D-O in the word doing? Well, there you say do, but in does you say duh. And when we say go and goes, but we say go and gone. So now it represents ga or ga. And the point being here that what do we call this base? Well, Carol Chomsky in 1970 wrote a totally classic paper that's cited all the time but often misunderstood, in which he suggested that children might be productively introduced to the fact that a morpheme doesn't have a pronunciation until it's in a word. And that is so central. It is exactly how that hypothesis is supported by the evidence. This isn't the base do, it's the base do. If I call it do, all of a sudden does seems irregular, and done seems irregular, but not if I call it the base do, because it doesn't have a pronunciation until it's in a word. And I can call this the base go because I don't know how it's going to be pronounced until it's in a word. And if you notice, I have a matrix over here with struct as the base, I'm sure you see bunches of words there: structure, construction, instruction, infrastructure. Well, how do you pronounce? Well, what is struct? It's not a word even, is it? It's a base, though, because it builds all those words, and every word has to have a base. So this must be the base if I know that these are affixes. But what is it if it's not a word? Well, it's called a bound base. Bases that are not free to stand as a word on their own. They have to be bound to at least one other element. They're called bound bases. Bases that are free bases are ones that can stand on their own, like do, go, table, love, have, caterpillar, any base that can be a word. But what would I call this base? Well, if I call it struct, well, that is how you pronounce it in instruct, but it's not how you pronounce it in instruction, because now you'd say struct, right? So instead of calling it by whatever sound I think it is, I'm going to spell morpheme. So that's a key thing we're going to hit again and again. And so you see how when you assemble families of words that share a base, that's when you can understand how the role of meaning is central and the role of sound representation is in the surface of meaning. It turns out this T grapheme can represent t in instruct and take and tell and table and, I don't know, fat or whatever. But if there's an I after it and or a U after it, that T can have a different pronunciation. But you can't spell structure with a CH because it's spelled the same no matter how it's pronounced. So it's a bit funny doing all this without hearing you respond to me, but that's kind of the introduction that I wanted to do. If you have any questions before I go on to the first questions from the group, you pass them on to Sue. Is there anything there, Sue?
I think you've answered most of them. One was, is NE a suffix, as in done and gone? I think you've kind of talked about that you have evidence for at least one other.
And that's a good point to raise, is that, you know, people often ask me, like, is that really a suffix if there's just one other word? Well, the question really to ask yourself is, what would be the reasonable criteria to come up with a definition? Well, do we need 30 words with that suffix? Do we need 10, 8, 6? The only definition that makes any sense to me is more than one. Now, I haven't found another word other than done and gone that share that same letter sequence for that same purpose, but I don't think I need more than 2. because I can't imagine what would be the justification for 4 or 5, if you see what I mean. So that's the way that I work with this. That was a good question to revisit.
And a related question, as people are listening, is someone said, could ONE be O plus NE?
In one of these words?
In the word one, so like the number one, O-N.
Okay. Well, let's take a look. If I think about the word one, could it be an O plus an NE? What you would have to do to prove, so you're wondering about this oops. Is this the structure of the word one? Well, for you to prove this, you would have to be able to make sense of that O. See, this is a great question, because the point is you can't make a word sum because part of it works. It has to be coherent, the whole thing. And if it isn't, if you can't prove that O, if NE is a suffix, then you're saying O is the base. And if you don't have evidence of O being base in any of the word, then you just give up on that hypothesis and call one a base. It's a good question. For example, one word that we may come to is this one. Well, we will come to this word at some point. Does anybody see a potential, is the word please a base or is it complex? Well, lots of people will suggest, wait a second, if I make a plea for help, that seems similar, so you put a P-L-E-A. Well, then you have to have a plus sign here, then you have to have an S-E suffix, if that hypothesis is correct. And so you go P-L-E-A-S-E, but now you have, before you can, this is a good hypothesis, because there's a meaning connection between plea and please, it seems. I make a plea for help, please help me. I say it's a good hypothesis not because it's correct or not because it's wrong, but because there's evidence for it. It makes sense. But does the evidence hold up? To draw this conclusion, I would have to have evidence that SE acts as a suffix in another word for the same purpose. I've yet to find that. Since I can't find an SE suffix where I did with NE and done and gone, since I can't find evidence of an SE suffix, I give up on the hypothesis. And so now I can say there's a base P-L-E-A and P-L-E-A-S-E. They might seem connected in meaning, and I think that they are, but I can't say they share a base because I can't make a coherent word sum, and that is what I call the structure test. So that was a useful question too. All right, well, before I go on with the words that I kind of picked from that group just to kind of get those things, here was some questions that came up, and I hope you're digging into a specific spelling question now.
Yes, we are seeing that.
Okay, and I want to do a couple of things here. These are great questions, but I want to show you something. I took this from the typed email that I got, but what I want to do now is I want to show you a way that I rewrote it with some linguistic symbols like this. And now you see the angle brackets? Hopefully you're seeing the same. Yeah, okay. And so you could just leave your mic on all the time if you like, and then I think there's a delay between when I hear you. I hope that you noticed as soon as those angle brackets came in, it is just so much easier to understand the question. Because when you see the text without it, it just all meshes into one thing, and it's harder for me to read. When I first was suggested to do this, when it was first suggested to me to do that, it seemed like this extra hassle. But my oh my, I just can't read text without it anymore. What the angle brackets are is the linguistic symbol for saying what's inside here you name as a letter name. And that just makes it 100% clear when I do this work. Now this says my daughter is struggling with the the way I could read this is with the S grapheme and the C grapheme, the SC grapheme, and SK. Now notice I didn't say SK grapheme because there isn't an SK grapheme, but there is an SC grapheme. And so I can say this is an SK, but I can't call it an SC digraph. But she's mostly struggling with this SC. And so she's asking, well, we get the S and the C, and I think that what we're talking about is that you can use the C grapheme for S if there's an EI or Y after it. So you have that idea down, which is great. But what about this SC, like in science and scene? Why do we need both? And I think what you're saying, when you say, why do we need both SC, what I think what was really meant is, why do we need SC as well as an S and a C? Well, again, going below, here's the thing. The suggestion was if we just use S for S, then all the problems would be solved. But see, this is the thing. This is working on the assumption that all we need to do is represent the sounds of words and we're fine. Someone also asked about these words. How would we separate the words sent and sent if we just had an S verse? We need multiple ways to represent sounds in English in order to follow the conventions of all orthographies, which is to represent the meaning of words. And since we have so many homophones, we need multiple ways of writing graphemes. It is not irregular that we have multiple graphemes for a single phoneme. It's actually, most graphemes can represent more than one phoneme, and most phonemes can be represented more than one grapheme. And I love this next, in your own question, you answered the question. It must have something to do with etymology. Yes, that you will be able to find SCs come up in certain places, and that they will link words, with similar meanings. So there's SCI is a delightful, fascinating base, and all of the words that have that base will use the SC. So that's just a quick example. But what I want to highlight for everybody, this is a great question to get. But what I want you to see is that the underlying assumption here is, it's crazy that we have all these ways to write S. Wouldn't it be easier if we just had one letter for one sound? The problem is that would not work in English. It might work pretty close to it in some languages, but we have English. We're not trying to represent Finnish or German. We're representing the English language. And so the constraints are for English speakers. I hope that helps. And then here's another one. Also the Z, or the S and the Z, as in these words. Now I rewrote it again. Hopefully you agree with me that when I see those angle brackets, I know what's going on here. So here's the similar question. We have the S and the Z. How do you know which is which in all of these words? And why do we have these two things? And in fact, notice in the sentence that you asked, we had also an as and words. But you can't get away from this. Well, let's again go beneath the assumption and see what provokes it. So let's just think about this question for a second. If you had a child or a teacher or an adult who was asked this question, what's the most common way to write Z? Notice these are not angle brackets, by the way. These are slash brackets, which means there's phonological information in there. That might look like the letter Z, but it's actually, because it's got the slash brackets, this is a Z. Now, most people would answer that question that the most common way to write Z, of course, is with a Z. Well, let's just check that. Here's a page of text that I got from a grade 1 class ages ago. And it was used for something else in this class. They had purposely put some errors in it, and then they were going to do some edit. But let's just look at this page for a second and see how many words have a Z phoneme in them. Well, when I looked at it, I found 13. All 13 Z phonemes are written with an S in this page. There's 18 S's. Only 5 of those S's are being used to write S. Not one Z phoneme on this page is written with a Z, because there's not a Z on the page. Now, I'm not saying, I didn't pick this page for this purpose. After the session, open a page of book. You won't find a page of text that doesn't have a Z phoneme in there somewhere. You'll find lots of pages without a Z grapheme. So what we need to do is teach how the system works. This S grapheme is a common way of writing S, yes, but it also writes Z. And in fact, it writes Z way more than does the Z. And the Z is pretty boring. It never, ever represents S. It can represent Z, and it may do some other things. It does at least one other thing I know of. But this is what we need to tell kids. This is the world that they're going to encounter. And what might be the result of teaching kids that S is for snake and Z is for zoo? We think we're helping them, but have you ever seen a kid put a Z where they should have put an S? Well, the reason they did is because they were taught to write a Z, an S, right? Write a Z for Z. And we say this, we think this, even though in our everyday experience, the evidence has always been against it. The evidence has always been S is way more common way of writing Z. But what we get taught away from what is reality. And what we need to be able to do is start to check our assumptions with reality. So now that we have this, we can come back. Well, one result of, by the way, what I was trying to do here, one result of being taught since we were kids and then continuing to teach kids that S is for snake and Z is for zoo is this question. Because this question would never occur if the understanding from the beginning was that, well, of course we could use S for all of these words because S is a common way of writing Z. Does that make sense? So you see, we end up with these frustrating spelling questions that shouldn't even be questions. They should be questions if we were taught in kindergarten how these things work. Now, I am going to take, let me just take a quick look. Yeah, I'm going to take one of these words. So we talked about the word please before. Let's just take a look at that. Are you seeing the word please now, Sue?
Yes, we are seeing that word.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to ask everybody to consider for the moment is, so we have the S representing Z, which we now know is totally common. Why is there an E there? What's the final non-syllabic E in please doing there? What's that single silent E doing? Any ideas coming at you?
Not, let's see, somebody, to show it is not plural.
Ah, someone is excellent. So somebody has encountered this fact that I never encountered until my 9th year of teaching, because often when I ask this question, people will think, well, because it's to make that so it doesn't say ples. Well, you're thinking about the rule that we do teach kids that, you know, if you have a single silent D, you take mat and it becomes mate, and if you have cut, you have a short U, but if you have the E there, it's cute. As if the single silent D's job is to make a vowel long. Well, we can't say that it is its job because it's not doing it here. It's not doing it in freeze, right? It's not doing it in many words. So it must be doing something else. So I can say that one of the jobs of the single silent T is that it can signal that a previous single vowel letter represent the sound of its name, but it's clearly not doing that here. And please is just a convenient one to use because, sorry, if I just go ahead and try and write this word without it, I end up with the word please. It's just that it's a different please. So I have a controlled experiment here. This E is clearly playing zero phonological role because when I don't have it, it's still a homophone. So somebody suggested that it's stopping it from being a plural, which is something we'll talk about in a second, but it's doing something else too, isn't it? What else is this E doing?
You want me to hear the other things people have hypothesized here?
Sure.
We've got plural canceling, we've got make the vowel before it long, we've got give the S a voice. SVZ cannot ever be at the end of a word.
So let me stop you there for a second. I want everyone to note how many of these suggestions are about pronunciation. Is giving the S the Z sound. It doesn't need a need to represent a Z sound. The S can be Z all over the place, and it happens all the time, right? Like I can write dogs. Oh, sorry, dogs. I can write dogs. The S is a grapheme that can represent Z. It doesn't even need another letter to tell you that, and it is. What I want to be really clear here is this is a convenient pair of words. This E has zero job in pronunciation, and my evidence for that is when I don't have it there, the word is a homophone. Please and please. I made many pleas for help. Please help me. So we have to reject any sense that this E has got a phonological role. But you see how we can't help go there because we've always been focusing on that. But one job, well, let's take it, what is it? This is many pleas for help. Well, that's the one person noted, is that this is the structure of many pleas for help. P-L-E-A-S. That's what the S is here for in please. We don't have an E at the end of please because then it wouldn't be a plural. There's no need for that E. But there's another thing that this E is doing that's very lovely. It's got two jobs. His other job is it prevents us from having homographs. We have homophones here that we want to be spelled different because they mean different things, so it's a good thing. We can have the E here but not here. But I want to come back to this plural canceling thing because that is when I first discovered the plural canceling marker, I was just so knocked out. This also I see described in Vinetsky's American Way of Spelling. He talks about a plural canceling marker, but he doesn't talk about, he uses this word as his example. Now, he's not saying that there's such thing as a ner and that we have to have this E to prevent it from looking like more than one ner. What he's signaling is that as literate English readers and writers, when we see a word in print that can be plural, if it has a final S, it will be plural. So if we wrote nurse like that, if it was in a sentence where it said the nurse came and helped me or something, your brain would get confused by this final S that looks like it's a plural. Sorry. And then you would think, wait a second, what's a ner? And if you think for a millisecond what's a ner, you've disrupted the meaning making. And the purpose of orthography is to make meaning making as easy as possible. The whole purpose of the orthography system is meaning representation, so it's evolved for that purpose. I have no idea who did it, but there was a person one day who was getting bugged by words looking like they were plurals when they weren't, so he just said, you know what, I'm going to plunk an E there, because that is bugging me. Now, nobody else had to do it, but apparently other people thought it was a good idea too. And the spellings that fit the best for the most people are the ones that survive. And that's why we have this convention. We didn't always have this convention. You had to have the problem for there to be an evolutionized solution. And that's the solution that came up. And because it worked, we just apply it. We don't know about it. We don't have a conscious awareness of it if we don't teach it. But that's what happens. And take a look. These, please, chase, fuse, hose, base, cheese, all of those words in the list have a final E there as a plural canceling marker. In some of them, it's also functioning to signal the pronunciation of the vowel, but it doesn't have to. Now, this word has is interesting because that has a final S, and it's not a plural. And this is something that I'll send a link in the handout to something about function and content words, and that's something that's an opportunity to learn about function and content words. So that was one thing to deal with there, that we need to understand that S and Z both can represent, or no, S can represent S, or Z, Z can only represent Z. The use of a Z is another way of plural canceling, isn't it? There's other ways of plural canceling as well. So that was that question. Now another one.
Can I jump in before you go on? There's one other question I would just add that maybe you would want to address. One person asked, and I think this is a common question, but then how do we know to use Z for freeze and S for cheese? It still ends up being about a lot of memorizing.
Well, I mean, it may, I'm not going to tell you that if you work at this, that you are going to have the explanation for every single letter and every single word. Now, I guarantee you that there's going to be an etymological story that explains the S or the Z. I don't expect the kid to investigate every one of those. When you or your child are particularly curious about why does freeze have a Z, I would definitely go, what does it mean? Well, something's frozen. Okay. Well, notice frozen has a Z too. So that's one way to help instead of it being an isolated thing. So some of it freezing. And how is it built? Well, I can't see any prefix or suffix. I might for a second think maybe it has something to do with free, but that would mean that ZE would have to be a suffix, so I reject that hypothesis, so it's a base. So I think about related words. Well, one kind of related word is frozen. So frozen is going to help me remember the Z. But now I've got down to another kind of, I had this chart that I should be looking at right now. Where's my chart? We're going to get to it in a second. Well, I don't want to show it yet. There it is. We're going to look at a chart like this. When we think about relatives, the other kind of relatives is etymological. And so my guess is that the actual trail to the discovery of understanding why we use the Z instead of the S in those words is going to be one based on the history. And it's up to you to decide when is it a good time to dive into that question and when it's not. And the answer really is the curiosity of your kid. Hopefully that helps. By the way, there's lots of spellings I haven't sorted out yet, and I don't ever expect to understand them all. But here's my little pontification on that. I often ask people, do you how many of you out there are comfortable doing calculus? Most people say no. But if I ask you, do you believe that calculus is a system that works? I don't know anybody who says they don't believe calculus works. And then I can say, well, the fact that you can't do calculus isn't evidence that calculus is crazy. Whether or not I can explain to use Z or S in cheese or freeze isn't evidence that the system is crazy. It's evidence that I don't yet know that answer and that I can investigate it. By the way, under no circumstances should we assume that because freeze and cheese rhyme that should explain that they both use a double E or one uses an S or one uses Z. There's many ways of writing those down, so it's just happenstance that they both share a double E. What we need to do is look at the meaning and the history to find out why there's a double E, why there's an S. Okay? So hopefully that is helpful so far.
Great.
What I wanted to do next was to kind of take launch off of another question. One of the questions that was sent to me is how can the spelling of the word design. So I'm just going to use this word as a launching pad for the whole process of doing a scientific investigation. And one thing that's nice, and this is what you will find as you dive into this, one part of this question is already resolved. We shouldn't be surprised by that S. It's a common way of writing Z. So that's what you see how when you take on something one place, it can take something else. It'll help us elsewhere. But let's take this question on in a way that builds on the linguistic understanding, because actually before we do that, everybody out there, it'd be mean to Sue and fill her with emails or whatever we're text, I guess. Why would somebody ask about the spelling of design? Why? What is it about this word that makes it a spelling question?
Silent G. You can't hear the G. It's not at all phonetic.
And see, we are always coming back to the assumption that the primary job of spelling is to represent sound, and that when the sound letter correspondences that we were taught aren't in evidence in the spelling system, that the answer must be that the spelling system is crazy, as opposed to what we're supposed to do in science. Wait a second, if my hypothesis isn't explaining the data, maybe it's my hypothesis that's wrong. Now, I'm going to do something dangerous. Can I stop the screen so I can just, there's a story that I like to tell. We'll see how this.
Loudly here, yes.
We're going to live on the edge here. So in theory, you're seeing me now?
In theory, but not yet.
Okay.
But, well, we're seeing you. I mean, we've been seeing you all along. You're just smaller.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Maybe it was a bad idea.
Before we couldn't keep the keynote up, now we can't get rid of it.
Okay. Okay. I don't know what you're saying, but we'll just go to the keynote.
Someone says they don't see you at all now, so.
Okay. I'm just going to go back to the keynote and play it safe. So, I don't know if you can see me or hear me or what you can, but here we go.
Yeah, send me a note if you guys can't see Pete. A couple people say they can see you, so you're still there.
Okay. Okay.
Some people haven't seen you all along, so we'll have to work this out.
I think that what's happening is they might have my image underneath something else. But anyways, the thing I want you to understand how primary this is. We think design is crazy. We think the homophones are crazy. We think all of the words that we looked at. Well, why don't I just have that as what we look at? So all of the words that were presented here as examples of spelling being crazy, they're all presented here because the letters aren't representing the sounds that we were taught. Why is it so crazy to believe that maybe what we were taught is the problem, not the spelling system? And so here's the story that I like to use as my analogy. I think everybody has seen old maps of Africa when people were sailing first trips around the Cape to do the spice trade or whatever. You see the maps, those maps of Africa, and you can kind of tell it's supposed to be Africa, but it looks kind of wonky. Why is that? Well, because you had a couple of dudes sailing around in the boats, and they were making the map from the stars. They did as good as they could. So obviously the map wasn't as good as it can be now. But here's the thing. It seems to me that the way that we are teaching about reading and writing in school is that we have that old wrong map of Africa, and we're sailing around. And when we look at our map and we look at the land, the coast, and we say, wait a second, the coast isn't where my map says it should be, then we say the land is in the wrong place. We blame the land for being in the wrong place because it doesn't match our map. That is the same thing as blaming the English spelling system for these spellings that are offered here because they don't match what we were taught in school. When we have a hypothesis and it doesn't explain the data, this is not example. These are not evidence of spelling being crazy. These are evidence that our hypothesis of how spelling works doesn't work. And what we're supposed to do is reframe it. And already, I bet you, a lot of you can see things that you didn't notice before. Take the word because. As soon as you make a word sum with that one, oh, it's the base word, the word cause with the BE. BE plus C-A-U-S-E. Oh, look at that plural canceling marker right there. And what's the name of this base? It's not. Sorry?
We're not seeing that. I don't see that on your screen at all. Did you type that on that screen?
I did. What screen? I'm on my. Oh, here we go.
I'm on a different page here. This says, how can we understand the spelling of the word?
Okay. Hopefully you're coming back with me. I'm looking at the map. Are we here now?
We're at commonly presented evidence that English.
Okay. So what I thought I was brilliantly pointing you to is this page of evidence of spelling being irregular that actually isn't evidence of spelling being irregular. It's evidence that the hypotheses that were used to teach us about the writing system were being falsified. This is a page of falsification of what we were taught. It's not a page of exceptions. What I'm saying is, it's like looking at that map. We can't blame the land for being in the wrong place. We blame the map for being wrong. We can't blame the spelling system for being wrong. We blame what we were taught about it for being wrong. And so now, like, because is another one of those common ones, but as soon as you look at structure and meaning, you see the BE plus the C-A-U-S-E. Here's our plural canceling marker that we know before. This, when it's on its own, is the word cause, but when it's the base of because, it's pronounced cuz. But that's because we don't pronounce this as a base. This is the base C-A-U-S-E because you don't know how it's pronounced until it's in a word. Well, here's the word business. Everybody says it's crazy. Well, of course it's not. It's just it's the word busy with a Y-I change, which is totally conventional, with an N-E-S-S suffix. There's nothing strange about it at all. But we're convinced, oh, here's our old friend does, right? Oh, there's these ones. Oh, we took care of that one already, right? It's like it's just the way it is. It's not weird. But so what we want is these things that we think of exceptions to become things that are signals of what we have to learn. So hopefully that was helpful. Now what I wanted to do, come back to this word design. we think it's crazy because there's a silent G. Well, it's not a silent G. It's there for a reason. If it's a silent G, it's there, and we think it's there randomly, well, then we're just accepting that it's crazy, as opposed to saying, wait a second, that's cool. I don't know why there's a G in design. I bet you there's something there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to investigate that question based on the linguistic understanding of how orthography works, and that is this interrelation of morphology, etymology, and phonology. And this set of questions that we're going to learn to work with are built exactly on this, because you ask, what does it mean? How is it built? What are the related words? And then we need to understand the grapheme-phoneme correspondences. But those grapheme-phoneme correspondences are influenced by morphology and etymology, so you can't understand them without the other. So let's go ahead and do it. So as you see, I take this big version, hopefully you're seeing Stuck on the Spelling. Here's my little chart on it. So let's take it with design. So if I ask you, what does the word design mean? Well, you might say, I'm going to make an architectural design, or my students made a beautiful designs of flowers or something like that. So I can even, here's an example. So here's an architectural design example, and here's a design of a flower. Okay, but that still doesn't tell me why there's a G. So how is, next question, of course, is how is it built? So now we look at it and we say, well, is it a base or is it complex? Does anybody see a base or a prefix or a suffix in this word?
Somebody's put DE, somebody's put SIGN with prefix DE, and somebody says SIG.
Okay, so I think we have this, and we might have had another hypothesis, like with the N being separate. And I don't know if there's others.
I think that's mostly what we've got, yep.
Okay, now, so good. I always love it when we have more than one hypothesis. Well, I think we can be quite confident that there's a DE prefix in the world. If I jump to my dictionary, I'm not going to, you guys aren't going to see it, but I see a DE with a dash, and I find words like descend, deduct. I find all sorts of examples of a DE prefix that I can prove. So there is a DE prefix, and there's an SIGN word. So assign my name. Now, I do know an N suffix in words like know and known and show and shown. But SIG is causing me to wonder. I don't know what SIG is. So until I have evidence of that, I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm going to stick with SIGN and put that to the side. So it looks like, I wonder if there's a link between design and the base word sign. Now notice I said base word. Once I put that base in a word, I can pronounce it. If I call it a base, it's SIGN. If I call it a base word, I can say sign, because it has a pronunciation when it's a word. So now we've got this analysis. Now we are reminded, oh, think of relatives. So we did think of relatives. We thought one relative, DE plus SIGN, and SIGN is the base. I wonder what other relatives we could think of if SIGN is the base. Any other
I've already got some.
Yeah.
Yep, other people, we've got some hypotheses here. We've got signal, we've got signature.
Well, and you're ahead of the game, because I expected someone to go for signature there. Signal, there it is. So that's cool. So if, excuse me, if sign and signal share a base, well, that would be interesting. And then we would have the same spelling of the base, and we shouldn't be surprised, because what's the name of this base? Well, it's not sign. If we're right, it's SIGN. Again, you don't know its pronunciation until it's in a word. What's the name of this prefix? It's not D, it's DE. You don't say design, you say design. In design, it's pronounced D. But in defibrillator, maybe it's DE, I don't know. Or maybe it's D, I'm not sure. But the pronunciation of these things shift. But I have a question for you. These word sums seem to work, but we have to be careful. Because what's the meaning connection between design and signal? Maybe there is, but I want to just show you something we got to be careful. Word sums are so critical, but they aren't sufficient on their own. Take a look at this. What if I took the word discovery and I analyzed it like this? Well, oops.
I like
I got a kick out of this one. This is on the word microscope that I hope you guys check out. It was the first thing that ever suggested this to me, and it made me laugh out loud. Discovery is not a disco plus vary. There is a disco in the world, there is a vary in the world, and these are they're spelled. So the word sum works potentially structurally, but we disregard it because there's not a meaning connection. And brother, well, there is a BROTH in the world, and there's an ER suffix in the world. But as far as I know, a brother isn't one who broths, so I have no evidence that this word sum works. So it's not enough to just have a word sum that seems to work. That's what we have here. So what I need you to understand is that we have to have a structure test, which is the word sum, but we also have a kind of a meaning test. Now, in the case of disco, these ones, we don't feel we need to go to a resource to disregard them because it's so obviously crazy. But these ones, I'm not so sure without some evidence. So that's why this chart that you'll have access to reminds us, when we talk about relatives, we're not just talking about morphological relations, and I'll hopefully have a chance to show you the word searcher, but also etymological relations. So what we need to know is, do the words design and signal and sign share a meaning connection that I can trace? And the way that you trace it is you go into the origin. You look at the roots. Now, I use the word root only for historical information. Base I only use for morphological. That's not how the world always does it, but it is crazy to have root and base both mean the same thing in some cases and not in others. So it's just going to be a total ease on your brain and your kids if we reserve base for current English morphological structure, like SIGN, and root for these things that aren't English. And when I looked up sign in my Oxford, I went to the origin. It was from Middle English, from Old French, from Latin signum. And there's the UM suffix in Latin, and there's the spelling in the history of the word that we get surfaces in our spelling, and the underlying denotation there is mark token. Well, that's interesting. What is a design? Well, hopefully you are seeing my pictures again. Are you seeing the architectural drawings and the picture of the flower?
Not quite yet, but while we're waiting, I'll throw a question out here related. Somebody asked, what does, there it is, now it just popped up, what does the prefix DE mean?
Well, I would recommend that you go to your dictionary and you look at some of the meanings of DE, because there could be more than one. The thing to know there, it's an important question, bases carry an underlying orthographic denotation, and you find that denotation from the root. So we are going to find that SIGN is the base of the word design. It carries an echo of that underlying root we just found, signum, from marker token. But prefixes and suffixes don't carry meaning in that same way. They have like a semantic force on whatever base or stem they're fixed to. And some prefixes have more common functions, but you can't always rely on it. And suffixes often can signal a grammatical function, but you can't add up the meaning of these pieces to get to the meaning of the word. So that's something that you just have to investigate over time. Not a satisfying answer, but we just have to deal with what it is. And how much time do I have left, Sue?
You have 15 minutes. I was just going to give you 15 minutes.
That's what I thought. Okay, so I'm going to jump through a few things here. Now, you see that this architectural design, think about it. This is not a house. It's a design of a house. It's a mark or token. It's a token, right? It stands in the place of the house that's going to happen. This isn't a flower. It's a design of a flower. It stands in the place of a flower. So now that we have taken a little dive into the history, we start to, it's not that you didn't know what the word design means, but now you have a deeper understanding because you have, if you start to teach the idea of what is a marker token, well, a signature, you sign your name, or when you sign your name, it is a marker token of the person who signed it. And so we get to deepen this understanding. And now we can go to the pronunciation bit, and now we see that, in fact, we didn't have a GN sign at all. We had a GN. And we're going to discover how, we can figure out how that works, but in the word sign, the GN is representing in the word signal, it's doing something else. And this is where I recommend the Gina Cook's Lex cards, because if you have access to those, you have a card, you'll find a GN, and look what it does for us. It gives us all this information. Here's the phonic symbol for there's the IPA symbol You can see this is the digraph we're working on. It has na, nom, sign, dane. Maybe initial or final in a base. May sound as g between two vowels. So look at that sign signal. Gnostic, diagnostic. So this GN digraph has more than one pronunciation. Well, so do most graphemes. So it's nothing crazy. And then there's this other version for the ny, as in poignant, and lasagna, and gnocchi, I guess, usually in French language. So if you have access to these kinds of resources, you can make sense of it. Now, it turns out that it was funny. Sue was laughing when somebody picked the word design because she said that was, she knew that I use this word a lot. So this turned out to be the word that I started in the lessons that you'll get in the handout that I give you. So you'll have access to these lessons. In my little book, there's a whole series of lessons that start with this. And what you do is you take this word and you find out what other words can you make with it with a matrix. And the matrix takes a central base and shows ways that other affixes or other bases can be fixed to it, and we can start to make words from it and make word sums. You see how the lines in the vertical lines in the matrix turn into plus signs in the word sums. If we had time, we'd dive in. Someone mentioned the word signature, but you notice in the word signature, hopefully you're getting on to the new page now, I have the SIGN base, and I'm going to add the suffix ATE, and then I'm going to add the URE suffix, and then I say is rewritten as, and then you notice that this E doesn't surface in the final word. So that's a good excuse to learn about vowel suffixes. I have SIGN, AT no E, URE, and what we're going to have to learn is these are the kinds of suffixes that always replace single silent T's. And if you have time with the other stuff later, the next activity I do is with the base PACK, and I've set these words, package, with packages, packaging, packaged, and in those words, these suffixes replace the E. The next activity then is to say, once to provoke the question from the kids, how do I know when to drop these E's? Then I say, well, let's check it out like scientists. I give you a matrix with this base. Notice this single silent E is not making this long. There must be another job with that E. And now I add these suffixes, some of which do replace the single silent E, some of which don't. And with this, I've never had a young class that couldn't come up with the hypothesis that suffixes start with the vowel letter, vowel suffixes that replace single silent E's. And we can go back to signature, and we can see that, oh yeah, with signature that worked because it was replaced by URE suffix, and packages, it was with the ES suffix. So this hypothesis is explaining more data than it was there to prove it. And then the next activity is with a whole page of investigations to see if this hypothesis holds up. So you see how we do that kind of science. I'm going to just jump into a little bit of the research and then show you some of the online sources that you have. Before I jump into the research, do you have questions about what I just whipped through? Okay. If it comes up,
I don't see any questions in particular. A lot of people are, I mean, it's interesting. Lots of hypotheses coming in, lots of information. People are looking up things. It's cool to see.
okay.
We do have one comment that someone's interested in more information on what you do, and so you're going to send a link you're going to send a follow-up link to some information, and people can kind of follow that link to learn more
That's
about
right. And I just did a whole bunch of other workshops that had a full-on follow-up thing, and I'll just share that with you guys, and then you have tons of stuff to follow up with.
Cool.
Now, one thing we need to do is kind of take a look at the research. I think everybody agrees that learners deserve instruction that represents how the writing system works. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. Well, it turns out that English is morphophonemic. which means that there's this interrelation between morphemes and phonemes, and what we've discovered is you don't know how a morpheme is pronounced until it's in a word, but the spelling stays the same, so you need graphemes to represent multiple phonemes. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So instruction, if it's going to represent how the writing system works, we have to teach about that interrelation. It's not enough just to teach about a few prefixes and suffixes. You have to teach the interrelation. And this is the argument that Gina Cook and I made in this article that I can link you to that was in the IDA. So what have the research recommendations been about morphological instruction, and what's the current evidence? Well, one thing I want to kind of give some context for is that I think everybody here is probably familiar with this whole reading wars idea. There was this huge, and maybe still going on, fight between phonics and whole languages in an instructional approach. Now, there's decades of research showing that of those two approaches, that phonics was more effective. You've probably seen these kind of references for a couple of decades, that every time that question was tested, phonics type instruction was shown to be more effective than whole word type instruction. The question I want to ask you, though, is what does that tell us about morphological instruction? And the answer is actually it tells us 0, because to say something about the effect of morphological instruction, you have to test the effect of morphological instruction. And when you compare phonics to whole language, you aren't testing morphological instruction. Now, one of the problems that I think has happened is, and I cite this book a lot just because it was so seminal, but I don't think that she was the first to say it. I'm sure she wasn't the first to say it. But there was a common feeling of this. So she made the argument, although teaching older readers about the roots, by which she means base morphemes, and suffixes of morphologically complex words may be a worthwhile challenge, teaching beginning or less skilled readers about them may be a mistake. I've added that emphasis. So she's making a hypothesis, which is a fine thing to do, but it's not a finding. This is a recommendation from research, but it's not a research recommendation, because it's stated without evidence testing morphological instruction. And it's nothing wrong with putting us like a hypothesis, but what the research community needs to do is test it. Now, the thing that I find is that this hypothesis is we behaved as if this were strong evidence for it, but we didn't actually test it for 2 decades, as far as I can see. Are you now seeing the meta-analysis page?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
There it is. Now it's up and we can see that.
So at this point, we have 3 meta-analyses of morphological instruction and 2 reviews. And the first time, in which all of them found positive effects for the morphological interventions they looked at. So when we looked at overall groups, this Goodwin and Ann 2010 didn't only look at less able, but everybody found benefits overall. When people looked at young kids, ours was the only study that compared preschool to grade 2 outcomes to grade 3 and up, and the effects for the preschool to grade 2 were usually greater and always equal to at least the older. People have been saying, do the morphology later. But there wasn't evidence for that, and when we tested it, it turns out there's more benefit at the younger grades. And then that's corroborated by these other findings. And when people looked at less able, again, anybody who looked at less able found benefits there, and we actually compared less able to undifferentiated, and the largest effect was for the less able. So we have to remember that it was being recommended to avoid with those groups. It turns out they gained the most. And I have to emphasize, these are the studies of morphology that we have. In our study, we looked at 22 studies. Of those 22 studies, only 5 even addressed the idea that the spelling of morphemes is consistent despite pronunciation changes, which is central to understanding this. And there's a more recent study that I intended to put here, I'm not sure, by Victoria Devonshire, where she compared with grade 5 to 7-year-olds and getting a phonics program in the UK compared to instruction of morphology, phonology, and etymology with word sums in the matrix, And when you compare those two, the ones who were taught how the writing system works with that interrelation of those features for 5 to 7-year-olds, they got significant benefits in word reading and spelling in that group compared to the phonics instruction. So every time the question has been tested, we find teach about morphology and the interrelation to phonology, and if it's been looked at, etymology as well. So there is no evidence there's no research evidence I've ever found that says we should avoid morphology for anybody, and that just makes sense because we should just be teaching how the writing system works. But we shouldn't wait 20 years to test hypotheses. In the links that I send you, you will get, I can point you to that set of lessons I had with the SIGN was from my book, but that is based on the intervention I did in grade 4 and 5 class that found vocabulary benefits, and I'll show you some other articles. I got like 3 minutes. I will send you some links, including a video of my son reading just at the very beginning, and you'll see how I use this to help him read in reading in a fun way. And I'll point to this video of a grade 7 kid who just does a glorious description of what he's learned in his humanities class about what a dissident is. So notice it's not spelling class, it's humanities class, and in their assignments they took a word and analyzed its history and structure, and what he has to tell us is just moving. And it's something that he couldn't do without access to the writing system. So if I can do a quick switch, I'm going to have an attempt in the remaining minutes.
Sounds good. And while you do that, I'm just going to remind people, because I think people will be very interested in following up, and all that information will be coming. But if you go back to the email that you used to register, there are also 3 articles there, one of which is Pete's article with Gina Bowers Gina Cook from the IDA Perspectives, and then 2 more articles about structured word inquiry.
Are you seeing my web page now? Are you seeing my web page now?
Yes, we are, and I just had to unmute myself. Yes, we are.
Okay, so I'm just going to point you to some places that you can follow up with it. There'll be links to them anyways. You'll see this About WordWorks page. If you go there, you will see videos of public talks and investigations and links to videos and all sorts of stuff. And this is a link to Lynn Anderson's amazing blog for teaching young children, well, everybody, but it's particularly rich with young students. There's always a must-see links kind of thing. I have to add some new things. I highly recommend that you visit this link about the word microscope. I don't know how quickly it's going to come up, but for those of you getting started with this, if you get to this page, hopefully it's going to be coming up on your screen, there's a PDF here and a video showing you how this computer tool that Neil Ramsden made, where you type, are you seeing a picture of this now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so you can see
word microscope page.
You can see that it's a tool where you type in word sums. It builds a matrix. It has banks of morphemes to draw from, and you can. Anyways, I highly recommend you print off that PDF and you watch that video. It'll walk you through the structure and meaning test kind of thing. But it's something that would be a great follow-up. What I would do is print the PDF so you have it sitting next to you as you watch the video, and you'll see how that tool works. And whether or not you can use it, it's actually a really useful way to be reminded of the structure and meaning test. There's this word searcher tool that I'll show you the link for, but if you take any, so we did COVER for Discover. If I click that, you can find words, and then you have to figure out which ones work with the matrix. But I meant to show you that you have this key links page. I'm probably going faster than you can see. Are you seeing key links?
Not yet. And maybe one more thing here, Pete, and then we probably should wrap up because we're running late, or not running late. We're at our 8:30.
At our time, right? So here's the place to go. there's the Mini Matrix Maker. Here, these blogs are spectacular blogs of watching teachers do this in classrooms. And I highly recommend the most recent newsletter that you can just click on here. And there's a whole pile of videos of me teaching classes on here. So just explore. Almost all this stuff is free. I guess that's a good place to stop. I can answer questions unless we just have to go.
I think at this point we are probably we're getting lots of thank yous, and I don't see any questions coming in at this point.
Okay.
Pete, I do want to really thank you for your time. I think this has been really useful, and definitely hearing from a lot of the attendees that they're finding this to be something really thought-provoking, and hopefully we'll talk with you again.
Yeah, and if people have questions, they can email me and be happy to hear from them.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who attended tonight. Remember that the link to the recording on this will be available soon, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Good night.
Bye-bye.